the organizing principle about Brett Kavanaugh, if we were to put it, the first order issue of Brett Kavanaugh, and I think I said to Digby earlier in the show, is a difference between a theocratic regressive or a regressive theocrat on some level,
right.
with the choices. But there's a couple areas where he is has at least a more established track record, and it seems to me the primary one is in the realm of deconstructing the administrative state. This was something that Steve Bannon announced to CPAC, I guess, a year and a half ago. That was the primary agenda of the Trump administration, and Brett Kavanaugh really embraces that in many respects. Yeah. And also, walk us through this. Tell us about the Chevron Doctrine, and tell us about Brett Kavanaugh's perspective on the authority of agencies.
Sure. So, just to take a step back and I guess explain how agency regulation works, there's a lot of laws where Congress enacts a law and then leaves it to the agencies to sort of fill in the details of how the policy was going to work. So, for example, the Clean Air Act says that certain power plants have to use the best available cost-effective technology in order to reduce emissions. And the way that we determine what the best available cost-effective technology is that it's the job of the EPA to study the technology that's available, and then when they determine that there is a need to update the rules and plants need to update their technology, they'll push out a new regulation saying, hey, the technology's gotten better, now you have to use this. Kavanaugh would apply a very, very strong presumption against agencies being able to do that kind of updating and maintenance of the law. Basically what he has said is that for issues that are sufficiently important, there is an extraordinarily strong presumption against the agency being able to take the action that it tries to take during regulation. This is why he objected to President Obama's Clean Power Plan. This is why he said the FCC couldn't push out net neutrality rules. Just takes a very strict understanding of what agencies are allowed to do. And so that's bad in and of itself because it makes our government less dynamic. But it's also very troubling because when you think about how gerrymandered the House is, and when you think about how the Senate is so malapportioned in order to lock in Republican control of the Senate, it's very unlikely in the future we're going to see Democrats controlling both houses of Congress very often anytime soon. And so that means when you have a Democratic president, they have to rely on the power of agencies if they want to be able to govern, because the Republicans have a near lock on Congress. They're not going to legislate. And if you strip away the agency's power to do anything, then, what is the president going to do? I mean, I guess they still have the pardon power, but it's basically a broad agenda to make it so that only Republican presidents get to govern.
So, all right. So I understand at the very least the doctrine that agencies are set up in such a way to have a certain expertise that Congress could never have, and right. that this is the way for them to go about the business. They get the broad authority from Congress to do certain things, protect the environment, and right. maybe even more specific than that. And they're the ones who are supposed to execute it. And that doctrine was edified and developed through this case involving Chevron. But mm-hmm. How does Kavanaugh, where does he get that idea that, okay, agencies don't have this authority? I mean, Congress certainly has it in their power to curb right. the authority of agencies, right? And I mean, and when Congress writes a law that does not get as granular as it needs to be put in practice, isn't Congress basically saying that we authorize these agencies to do this?
So, I mean, Kavanaugh, I think, strikes me as a more pragmatic and less theoretical judge than someone like, say, Gorsuch. And what I mean by that isn't that, he's going to necessarily hand down better opinions in most cases. But, Gorsuch tends to start all of his opinions by opining on some grand theory of like, James Madison wanted this and philosophy, and therefore Republicans win. Whereas Kavanaugh tends to just start with, well, like, here's how I can read the precedents to get the result that I want. But what some of the more philosophical judges, people like Gorsuch, have claimed is they claim that agency regulation is bad because it should be Congress, as a matter of separation of powers, that gets to make the laws and not the agencies. And there's two problems with that. One is that Congress has made the law. Like in the circumstance that I described with the Clean Air Act, Congress passed the Clean Air Act. Congress decided that we should use the best available cost-effective technology to reduce emissions from power plants. And the only job that the agency has is the agency just has to figure out what this thing is that Congress has told it to go find. So Congress has made the law there. The other problem with it is that when you talk about the kinds of things that many of the judges are saying they want to do to reduce agency power, they aren't really shifting power from the agencies to the Congress. They're shifting power from the agencies to the judiciary. So
Right.
You keep bringing up this case, Chevron. Chevron said that when the law is ambiguous and it's unclear whether the agency has the power to regulate or not, courts should defer to the agency's judgment. And if you overrule Chevron, that means courts will not defer, and the court will get to decide whether to veto a regulation every time one of these cases comes up. So you're not.
So in other words, we'll be very activist as judges, right? Which is the bugaboo, I guess, of conservatives.
That's exactly right. And like the other thing that I'll note is like Chevron came down in 1984 when Ronald Reagan was president. And when it came down, conservatives loved Chevron. The biggest defender of Chevron for many, many years was Justice Scalia. Because at the time, like Reagan was in power, Reagan was using his agencies primarily to deregulate. And the idea that the courts would have to defer to Reagan's agencies and when they were doing conservative things, like, Republicans loved that idea. Conservatives
Right.
loved that idea. Now, the moment where this shift came was when Obama was president. And that's when, the agency, that's when the Federalist Society and all the conservative groups started saying, well, no, maybe we aren't into Chevron anymore. The reason why I think they still believe this, even though Donald Trump is president right now, is because they know they control the courts. So, what they want is they don't want a situation where the courts engage in a good faith examination of regulations, regardless of whether it's Obama or Trump or someone else in office. What they want is for their loyal Federalist Society judges to have maximal powers so that when there's a regulation that the Federalist Society approves of, they'll say, oh, yeah, that regulation is great. And when there's a regulation the Federalist Society doesn't approve of, they'll say, oh, yeah, that exceeds the agency's power.
All right. Well, look, we got to take a break here in a moment. And when we come back, I just want to touch on, I know Kavanaugh also found that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was too independent, even though that's the way it was set up by Congress, right? I mean, this is
Right.
more judicial activism. And we should talk about that. I also want to talk, obviously, about abortion rights. And we should talk about Kavanaugh's writing about his perspective, which has evolved over the years on whether or not a president could be subject to lawsuits and to testifying. We got to take a quick break. I'll be right back with Ian Millhiser. We're talking about Brett Kavanaugh.